Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listeners, and welcome back to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I'm your host, Nicholas Goroff, and tonight we're taking a walk through the quiet rows of a country orchard, the kind of place where the trees stand neatly in formation, where the earth is soft and rich, and where the fruit hangs ripe, sweet, and ready to pick. But sometimes the soil remembers more than it should. Before we sink our teeth into tonight's tale of rural horror and impossible harvests, let's take a moment to share a few updates, especially for those of you following this year's Evil Idol voice acting competition. The Evil Idol 2025 voice acting competition is in full swing, and things are only getting more exciting as we head toward the new year. This season's lineup features a tremendous range of voice talent, and you, our audience, have already helped determine the top contenders moving forward. Throughout November and December, we'll be showcasing 25 standout contestants in a special slate of performances on our YouTube channel, and your votes will continue shaping the competition as it carries on into 2026. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's your chance. Hit that bell icon, keep up with every new entry, and support your favorite rising stars of horror. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of your favorite platforms, don't forget to follow the show there as well. A 5-star review helps new listeners discover us and keeps these weekly nightmares alive. Want to support us even further? Join our patrons area over at chillingtalesfordarknights.com. Members get early releases, ad-free episodes, and exclusive bonus stories, all for just $7.99 a month or less with an annual plan. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok for behind-the-scenes updates, story announcements, community events, and more. Now then, gather your courage. Tonight we're peeling back the skin of an orchard that bears more than fruit, and uncovering the secret that's been long buried. Our featured tale this evening comes from the mind of author Micah Edwards, a master of grounded horror and slow burn dread. It's a story about pride, community, and the kind of thing you wish you hadn't found once you finally dig deep enough. And performing tonight's tale is one of the rising voices from this year's Evil Idol competition, contestant number 20, Sophie Hartle. Sophie is a British-American artist living the dream in the magical Pacific Northwest. A longtime lurker and listener of all things spooky, she spends her days creating whimsical textile sculptures, producing digital illustrations, and spending quality time with her 2 feline companions. Now she's adding voice acting to her creative repertoire, and while she humbly calls herself an amateur, her talent speaks for itself. Sophie is among the 25 contestants advancing into the November-December showcase, and we are thrilled to feature her performance tonight. If you enjoy listening to her bring this story to life, and we think you will, be sure to swing by our YouTube channel afterward and show her your support in the competition. So, settle in and take a bite. From author Micah Edwards, I present to you The Bone Orchard.
There weren't ever many stories about the forest. It wasn't haunted. It wasn't sacred ground. It wasn't anything except a bunch of pine trees, and whatever else grows under pine trees. Probably mostly smaller pine trees. It's my understanding that pine trees, they tend to kill off anything else that grows near them. And you know, that might explain why this forest existed at all. The point is, it was just a big pine forest, covering a couple 100 acres or so. We all grew up playing, fishing, and hunting in it. There was never anything odd about it. No one ever went missing. No one found strange things in the pine cones. It was just a place, like any other. Sometime in the last decade, a fellow named Randy Summel bought that forest. He wasn't a local. He'd been a software developer, I think, or something like that. He'd made his pile of money and decided to retire out to somewhere cheaper. And our slice of the country fit that bill. So out to our neck of the woods he came, and he bought that forest. I imagine he probably paid less for that whole chunk of land than he did his Silicon Valley house. Certainly he had money left to throw around afterwards. I don't mean to make him sound like a jerk. He really wasn't. He didn't try to stop anyone from using the land like we always had. He didn't put up signs about trespassing or anything like that. He made a point of coming into town and meeting folks and actually getting to be part of the community. He really didn't fit in, but he did try, and we all appreciated that. Anyway, there was not much point in owning a forest without any sort of place to live, so naturally, the first thing he did was to clear out an acre or so and start building a house. It was a really nice place, filled with all sorts of modern conveniences. Huge picture windows with views of the forest, and a massive kitchen, even multiple dining rooms for entertaining, the whole deal. He invited folks round regularly to see it, and I suppose that was kind of showing off what he had in a way, but he really was a good host. Randy truly thought he was just going to kick back and relax, come into town to watch the game, have folks over for dinner parties, and enjoy his retirement from age 40 onwards. But our town isn't what you'd call fast-paced, and in short order, Randy found himself going a little bit stir-crazy. So, like any normal person would, Randy took up a hobby to occupy his time. Lucky for him, he still had plenty of that software money left. So his hobby was slightly larger than what most folks might have gotten up to. Heavy machinery could be heard on the property. Word got around that Randy was cutting down another big swathe of that forest, acreage by the dozen. Randy had decided to plant an apple orchard. He started the project almost from scratch, planting seedlings and bringing them up from tiny little sticks. He was proud of not taking the shortcut and bringing in mature trees. He said that his were going to be made fully from the ground he'd planted them in, and he didn't mind waiting a few more years for them to grow up the right way. Us townies thought differently. We thought maybe it wouldn't be so bad if Randy took a shortcut or two, maybe cut down on the amount of apple talk by a couple of years. But on the other hand, he did tend to buy rounds of cider for us all when we were talking about his upcoming orchard, so mostly we didn't mind listening. In any case, Randy calmed down after a few months. He was still having the time of his life in his orchard, and he was happy to show folks around if they wanted to see it. But basically, the next few years were trees just getting bigger 1 inch at a time, and Randy talking about all the products he was going to make with his apples. However, that all changed when the trees started bearing fruit. Now I've seen folks who weren't as proud of their newborn children as Randy was of those first apples. He came into town with a wooden bushel full of them, just like it was 100 years ago, handing apples out to anyone who glanced in his direction. As far as I know, no one noticed anything wrong with them that day. of course. We were all just eating them the way you eat apples, taking bites around the outside and throwing out the core when you were finished. Nobody was cutting them open then. So probably, those first ones were the same, and we just never knew it. Despite all those years of waiting and all that time Randy spent in the orchard, he hadn't figured out what to do with the apples once they were ready for harvest. He hadn't set up anyone to sell them to. He hadn't even set up a full-size cider press to squeeze the juice out of the fruit. All he had was a dozen acres of trees, all bearing fruit at once. The only thing he could really do was continue picking apples and bringing them into town. He told us to enjoy them now before he started charging, but it really wasn't long before we all had apples coming out of our ears. We were practically swimming in them. One can only eat so many raw apples, so folks started cooking with them and baking with them. Within about a week, the apples weren't the only thing being stirred in the pot. Whispers were starting. No one wanted to sound ungrateful. No one wanted to be rude or come across as strange. So it was all carefully couched in deniable language. People were all asking the same sort of question, though. Had anyone else noticed anything odd about the apples? More specifically, about the apples' cores? As it turned out, a load of us had. It took a lot of hemming and hawing and, well, it looks likes, but eventually, the word got around. Those white, stick-like things in the cores of the apples, they weren't unique. They were in almost every apple that we sliced open, all from Randy's orchard. We couldn't quite tell, but it didn't just look like a fragment of a bone. It actually was a whole bone. We were all very unsure about that last bit, and no one wanted to be the first person to say they'd found a bone in their apple. Mostly the fragments we found were just slivers, little broken bits that could have been anything, I don't know, like maybe a twig or some kind of odd growth, something normal like that. But a couple of folks found ones that were pretty clearly knuckle bones. And I opened up one apple to find a hollow little bone that ended in a knee joint. It looked like it had been snapped off a bird or something. None of the apples were damaged in any way. No one was sneaking these bones inside of them or anything weird like that. We made sure to choose apples that were pristine and unblemished. We began carefully checking them and then cutting them open with a surgeon's precision. To our great dismay, we found bone after bone in apple after apple. The only explanation was that the apples had grown around the bones. People were starting to kick around some pretty wild ideas, such as ghost trees and carnivorous apples snatching birds out of their nests. The next time Randy came into town with a pile of apples to give away, he noticed that folks were a lot less willing to take them from him. "What on earth's the matter? Hope I haven't appled you folks out already. There's a lot more coming. You're going to be in trouble if you've hit your limit already." He was all smiles and excitement still. Randy had no idea what was going on. Telling him was going to be akin to kicking a puppy. But we knew we had to do it. And besides, maybe he had a normal explanation for the bones in the cores of his apples. I know, that sentence sounds insane, but we had all hoped it might be true. You can tell yourself some pretty odd things when you're trying to avoid the truth. Randy did not have a good explanation for why his apples had bones in their cores. He didn't even believe us at first. We had to cut one open to show him, and then he still thought it was some kind of a trick. He took himself one, picking it from the middle of the basket, as if he suspected us of changing out the ones on the top. Then he carefully cut it right down the middle. The bone that fell out was one of the clearest ones yet. It was cracked in half, but despite that, It was very obviously the top joint of a human finger. Everybody was eyeing Randy pretty suspiciously at that point, and he was giving the eye right back. Somewhat reluctantly, and by unspoken mutual agreement, we called in the sheriff. This was well beyond what town gossip and whispers could sort out. We needed the help of the law. Sheriff Morley was pretty unhappy about the entire situation. It was complicated and confusing, and it wasn't exactly clear what crime had been committed. Obviously, it had to be illegal to give people apples with bones inside them. That sort of thing couldn't possibly be allowed. It's just that it was a little hard finding a specific statute to point to forbidding it. Just like the rest of us, though, Morley had eaten several of those apples. He didn't appreciate learning that he'd accidentally put something strange in his mouth. So he was motivated to find some reason why whatever was going on with Randy's apples wasn't okay. After a little digging around, he told Randy that he was investigating his orchard for violations of the Nutrition Labeling Act, and he was going to need to investigate the property immediately. It probably wasn't a reasonable citation. After all, who's ever seen an apple with a nutrition sticker? But it did sound official, and Randy wasn't inclined to fight it. He wanted to get to the bottom of this as much as any of us. More so, in fact, since it was his orchard that was tainted. We'd all just had a few apples to deal with, but this had been Randy's passion for the last half-decade. For him, this wasn't just a complaint about some oddities in the fruit. It was a personal attack. "I'll be taking one right off the tree when I get back," said Randy. "You might as well be there with me to see it. If this is some kind of a hoax, I'll be glad to have a witness. That way they can back me up. And if they are the problem, I guess I'm going to need all the help I can get sorting out what is going on. So bring anybody you'd like. Come on, follow me up there now." As you might have guessed, most of the town was invested in unraveling this mystery. We all piled in various cars and followed the sheriff and Randy out to his house. Excitement buzzed in the air. Our minds were reeling the entire way. Single file, we all piled onto Randy's property. His driveway was never meant to handle more than a few vehicles at once. But we all angled onto the grass at the edges of the lawn, and somehow we made it work. It had been a long while since any of us had been out there, and at that point we realized it was still a bit of a hike out to the orchard. Randy and the sheriff took off in Randy's golf cart, out along the track towards the trees. The rest of us, we crammed into the backs of a few pickup trucks and sped off after them. I'm telling you all of this to show the sort of quiet chaos lurking in the background. It wasn't a problem yet, but it was the sort of thing that could easily become a problem if anything went wrong. We were all far too fixated on the apples to think that far ahead, though. So the whole procession rolled up to the first line of trees. Randy hastily dismounted his golf cart with an apple picker in hand and snagged a piece of fruit closest to him. We all saw the limb bend when he tugged the apple. We watched the stem of the apple break, and then finally we saw the branch spring back up as the apple popped free. The fruit had grown there. There was no denying it. Sheriff Morley took a knife and cut the apple in half. Nestled in the center, neat as could be, was a human tooth. It was a molar missing one of its roots in a jagged break. It had no business being inside the core of an apple. I just really don't understand," said Randy. He spoke for all of us, really. Up until that very moment, I think we'd all been holding out hope that this was a trick or a joke or some sort of insane prank. But we'd all seen that apple come down together. We'd crowded around and watched as the sheriff turned it over and cut it open. It was whole before he took that knife to it. The only way the apple could have had a tooth inside its core was if the tree had put it there itself. Randy went to another tree, then another, then another. We all trailed along behind. watching as he took an apple from each one and split them open to reveal new bones. Some were just tiny fragments, looking more like toothpicks than anything structural. Others were almost whole. There were big ones and little ones. There were human finger bones and toes. There were creatures' wings and backbones. The only thing the bones had in common was that none of them belonged inside the core of an apple. Finally, maybe 15 trees in, Randy found one that didn't have anything inside of it except apple seeds. The look of relief on his face was comical. "See, they're not all like that," he said, pulling down another apple and cutting it open. Look, have a look at this one. This one's normal too." Whatever is going on here, it's not all of the trees. It's not the whole orchard. We all shoved in close to see the apple in Randy's hand. Sure enough, it was perfectly ordinary inside. We passed it around, examined it carefully as if maybe the bones were hidden behind the seeds. Meanwhile, the sheriff wandered over to tap on the tree. He was trying to figure out what made this one different from the previous ones. Something in the roots caught his eye, and he crouched down to scratch at the soil, pulling away clumps of grass. "You put this one on rocks?" he asked Randy. "Could be that's what's keeping the bones out." Rather hotly, Randy replied, "Excuse me, I'll have you know I had this entire area tilled to get rid of all those bloody pine tree stumps and their godforsaken roots. I can report that there aren't any sizable rocks left in this whole orchard." "Well, this is a big milky quartz-looking thing," said Morley, rapping on a piece he'd exposed. "Huh? Hang on a tick. This sounds hollow. What kind of—" Everybody went quiet at once. The sheriff knocked on the rock in front of him again. It was definitely hollow. From where we stood, we couldn't really see much of it sticking out of the ground. But the same thought occurred to everyone at the same time. Could this be a skull? Morley snapped back too, and he said very quietly, "Somebody get me a shovel. If this is human, this area is now a crime scene." The right thing to do would probably have been to clear us all out at that point, but I suppose Morley realized he'd have a riot on his hands if he'd tried that. So off Randy went, tearing across the grass towards his barn, and a few minutes later, he returned riding in a big yellow digger, one that barely fit down the rows. It knocked branches aside as it came, sending apples rolling free across the ground. I pictured the bones inside of them bouncing and tumbling, rattling against their cores. I wondered if the skull we were about to see was human. I could only imagine what it all meant. After a few minutes of speculation, I came up empty-handed and stared along with everyone else. We all waited on tenterhooks, anticipating what might be revealed. "What in the blazes did you bring that huge thing for?" Morley asked as Randy drove up. "You can't dig this up with that. It'd smash it to bits." Randy tossed a shovel to the sheriff and clambered down from the digger, letting it idle. "Listen, something's going on under my orchard. You can carefully dig up that skull first, but when you're finished, I'm making a big hole to see what's behind all this." The roots of the tree were tangled everywhere the sheriff tried to dig, but after a couple of tries and a lot of inventive swearing, he somehow managed to get the blade of the shovel under the skull and lever it out of the ground. It popped free in a shower of earth, but even before the sheriff lifted it out of the ground, it was obvious to all who witnessed that it was just the skull of a deer. We all let out a collective breath. From the small bit of the curve we'd seen, we'd been certain it was human. It was both a disappointment and a relief. It's still a bizarre thing to find tangled in the roots of an apple tree, but it wasn't human remains. And that was quite comforting, in a strange sort of way. "Not to worry. Don't panic. It's just a deer," said Morley. He sounded more relieved than the rest of us. "Yeah, that one is," said Randy, peering into the small hole. The sheriff's head snapped around. You what? There's another one under there. Look. Just past that big root there. Jabbing and chopping, the sheriff did his best at tackling the thick roots, but it was too far under the ground to be retrieved with any hand shovel. Step back, said Randy, who had climbed back into the yellow digger. I'll find out what's underneath my orchard once and for all. Us spectators backed up a step as he dropped the scoop into the ground and started to dig. The digger's teeth bit into the thick tree roots, scarring and mangling them. He pulled the scoop back up, scattering broken roots and dirt everywhere. We all gasped. Along with all that loose soil now strewn across the grass were dozens of skulls in various sizes. It seemed like most of them belonged to animals, but I could count at least a few that looked like they belonged to humans. There's a lot more down there. Hundreds, maybe even thousands more, Randy said, sending the scoop back into the ground. The next hole seemed to contain even more skeletons than earth. The bones, they spilled out everywhere. Innumerable amounts of them this time. They were shattered and fragmented from their unceremonious retrieval, but again, several human skulls were obvious in the mass. Please, Randy, stop digging, pleaded Morley, but he was already going in again. But there's more in there still. Hang on a tick. Would you have a look at that? There's something moving down there. With the digger's bucket midway in the hole, Randy peered out over the edge. Just then, as he leaned over, the excavator jerked as if caught on something, then it tilted forward violently. Randy yanked back on the controls, trying to raise the bucket, but it hung in place, straining against an unseen force. It stayed that way for several seconds before suddenly lurching forward, then aggressively backwards again. Released from whatever titanic grip had held it, the digger and Randy were sent flying backwards. They crashed into another tree, knocking it askew and ripping its roots from beneath the ground. Randy clambered out of the cab. Miraculously, somehow he was unscathed. Upon impact, as the tree's roots sprung from the ground, we all had a glimpse of something enormous tangled in them. I thought for a split second that it was just more collected bones. But then, I saw movement too. Whatever it was, moved in one long, snake-like mass. It was as thick around as a man's waist, and I saw at least 20 or 30 feet of length whip by as it vanished back into the ground. The entire serpentine structure was composed of bones, from human femurs and spinal columns to tiny ribs and teeth, all deftly arranged in a single flexible unit. The bones that it was made up of were not broken like the ones we had been finding inside the apples. They seemed more complete and much stronger. These were ones that were worthy of being put to use. It seemed like something was not just collecting the bones, but perhaps was selecting the bones. Could it be building something underneath the orchard? Was it somehow using the trees to remove its discarded waste? None of this made any sense. It wasn't even properly something I thought about. It just rattled around in my brain, like the bones inside the apple cores, or the tentacle itself under the soil. I was aware, however, that all this was a small piece of something much larger. I was already sprinting away from the scene before the thing under the ground had even fully disappeared. So it seemed were most of the spectators. The ones who'd driven their trucks to the orchard did not wait for passengers to climb aboard. They floored the pedals as soon as their engines started. Dirt fountained from spinning wheels as everyone sped down the driveway back into town. Screams could be heard as people were thrown from truck beds, knocked aside by fishtailing vehicles, and some were even crushed beneath tires. no one stopped to help anyone. It was every man for themselves. Those who didn't make it into the trucks, they just kept running. None of us looked back. The next few hours passed by in a blur. Us townfolk, we regrouped. We counted our numbers. We held our loved ones close. Then we coordinated and sent out a search party. But no bodies turned up that day. I can count 7 people missing from the town, the sheriff among them. I don't know why his disappearance feels like it matters more than the others. I suppose it's because he was in charge, the one responsible for us, as well as uncovering the truth. Rumors circulated town like wildfire, but all the gossip boiled down to one important question. We could barely utter it out loud, but we were all wondering the same thing. If the creature under the orchard absorbed our sheriff so easily, how were we meant to stop it from taking control of the rest of the town? Over time, things eventually settled down again. Unsurprisingly, most of us swore off apples and any apple-related products for the rest of our lives. A handful of us placed bets on whether Randy would cut down the orchard, burn it to the ground, or maybe just move away. But we were all dead wrong. Instead, he's had delivery truck after delivery truck clambering up his driveway, day in and day out. I'm not ashamed to admit that curiosity got the better of me, so I went and sneaked a peek. Well, from what I could tell, it looks like he's finally getting that full-scale cider press installed. You know, the machine for processing all those hundreds and thousands of apples. The mashers and the filters on it, they do look pretty solid. I imagine if they can handle the stems and seeds and cores of the apples, they could probably remove all sorts of other foreign fragments as well. It doesn't really matter what goes in. Cider comes out. The rest of the slurry goes right back into the orchard. You know, now that I think of it, bone meal really does make excellent fertilizer.
That was The Bone Orchard by Micah Edwards, performed by Evil Idol contestant Sophie Hartle. A quaint little apple grove with a body count beneath its roots, and a town that learned the hard way that sometimes curiosity isn't just dangerous, it's downright fatal. Whether it was the bones inside the fruit or the thing assembling itself beneath the rose, Edwards reminds us that what grows in silence often grows hungry. If tonight's tale left you unsettled, and I imagine it did, be sure to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and our sister site, creepypastastories.com, for more original horrors from talented authors like Micah and many others. And while you're there, consider supporting the performers, producers, and writers who bring you new nightmares every week. If you've enjoyed tonight's episode, take a moment to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your scares. Your feedback helps other horror fans discover the show and keeps this whole haunted machine running. Make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel as well. We'll be featuring all 25 rising competitors of the Evil Idol 2025 showcase throughout November and December, including tonight's performer, Sophie Hartle. Your votes and comments help shape the competition, and might just launch the next major voice in horror. If you want ad-free listening and early access to episodes, join our patrons area at chillingtalesfordarknights.com. Exclusive stories, bonus content, and uninterrupted chills are waiting for you, all for just $7.99 a month or less with an annual plan. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok for daily updates, story highlights, and upcoming community events. Until next time, listener, turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Sweet dreams, listener. Sweet dreams.
Chilling tales for dark nights.